This video is the second part of the auditory center nerve system. The first part covered from the sound information to superior body complex. This video will cover from inferior colliculus to sound recognition. Before beginning, I strongly recommend to watch the last video. If you don't have time or want to more focusing on higher level process of sound, I will give you short recap. Hearing is important not only for communication but also for localizing and identifying the sound source for unseen dangers or opportunities. In order to localize and identify the sound source, sound information difference between two ears are important, the interaural time and intensity differences. The sound is captured by the external ear and transformed into an electrical signal at the cochlea. This electric signal is conveyed from the cochlea to cochlear nuclei by cochlear nerves. The cochlear nuclei can be divided into ventral and dorsal cochlear nuclei. In the ventral cochlear nuclei, three different types of cells have different pathways and functions for their specialty of responding to different sound information. The dorsal cochlear nuclei help interpret spectral cues for the localization of sound sources by gathering information of head and ear positions. The result of all the processes from the cochlear nuclei are conveyed to the superior olive complex. Medial superior olive circuits are responsible for the interaural time differences. The systematical arrangement of the detectors that are receiving input from both ears can encode the interaural time differences. Lateral superior olive circuits are responsible for the interaural intensity differences. The head shadowing effect is the differentiation of the sound wave by the head, and this effect gives information of interaural intensity difference. You can see there are many processes going on already at the cochlear nuclei and the superior olive complex. It is not over. We are still on the brainstem level processing part. Although it is complicated, it will be more interesting when you understand how we know where the sound coming from and recognize what kind of sound it is. Let's start from the midbrain on the brainstem, the inferior colliculus. In one sentence, we can call the inferior colliculus convergence point and a branch point for auditory information. Their role is sending the auditory information to the cerebral cortex, the brain. The inferior colliculus is subdivided into the central nucleus, dorsal cortex, and external cortex. The central nuclei are tonotopically organized for their characteristic frequency. The majority of these cells are sensitive to interaural time and intensity differences in horizontal plane. They are also sensitive to spectral cues that localize sounds in the vertical plane. To localize sound accurately, they must ignore the reflection of the sound from surrounding surface that might distract the sound localization. This is called the pre-descent effect. The pre-descent effect is that suppressing all but earliest sound. In other words, the inferior colliculus inhibits the neurons that are activated by the reflections of sounds. Now, central nucleus neurons project to the thalamus and also to the external cortex of the inferior colliculus and the nucleus of the brachyum of the inferior colliculus, both are pathways, then project to the superior colliculus. The superior colliculus critical for reflexive orienting movement of the head and eyes to acoustic and visual cues in space. Why the function of the superior colliculus is critical for spatial hearing? The answer is simple. Different locations in the ventral plane could have identical interaural time or intensity differences. So the interaural level and timing difference alone cannot ambiguously code for a single position in space. Therefore, the convergence of acoustic cues with visual and other sensory cues is critical. The auditory map fits with maps of visual space and the body surface within the superior colliculus. Unlike the visual and somatosensory map, the auditory map is computed from a combination of cues that identify the specific position of a sound source in space and is not based on the peripheral receptor surface. So at the end of the reflexive orienting movement by the superior colliculus, the new auditory process will come. With a new sound and following all the auditory pathways that we already discussed, and this will lead to map additional auditory cues and also decide the superior colliculus need to reorient movement. The auditory cortex includes multiple distinct areas on the dorsal surface of the temporal lobe. The most prominent projection is from the medial geniculate nucleus of thalamus to primary auditory cortex. The primary auditory cortex contains a tonotopic representation of characteristic frequencies. Neurons are arrayed in a systematic reflecting the frequencies that best stimulate them. Neurons tuned to low frequencies are found at the rostral end of A1, and these respond to high frequencies in the caudal region. Because the cochlea encodes only frequency, a one-dimension map from the periphery is spread across to two-dimension surface of the cortex. This means that in addition to frequency, several other parameters are mapped on the surface of A1. These include neural responses, latency, loudness, modulation of loudness, and the rate and direction of the frequency modulation. Many auditory neurons in the cerebral cortex are sensitive to interaural time and level differences and therefore to the location of the sounds in space. The first sound localization pathway was in the superior olivary complex. That medial and lateral area was responsible for interaural time and level differences respectively. The second sound localization pathway in the cortex originates in the central nucleus of the inferior colliculus and ascend through the auditory thalamus area A1 and cortical association areas, eventually reaching the frontal eye field involved in gaze control. Eye or head movements can be elicited by stimulating the frontal eye fields. The frontal eye fields connect directly to the brainstem tegmentum premotor nuclei that mediate gaze changes, as well as the superior colliculus. But the midbrain pathway from the location-sensitive neurons in the inferior colliculus to the superior colliculus and to the gaze control circuitry can directly regulate orientation movement of the head, eyes, and ears. Why should there be a second sound localization pathway connected to gaze control circuitry? This appears to be a general difference between cortical and subcortical pathways. Subcortical circuits are important for the rapid and reliable performance of behaviors critical to survival. Cortical circuitry allows for working memory, complex recognition tasks, stimuli selection, and evaluation of their significance, resulting in slower but more differentiated performance. The auditory cortex has three areas. These areas are called core, which includes primary auditory cortex, the belt secondary auditory cortex, and the parabellary auditory cortex. These areas and their temporal lobe target both projects to largely different areas of the frontal lobes. The frontal areas receive anterior auditory projections and posterior auditory areas. They are generally related to non-spatial functions and related to spatial processing, respectively. The ventral what stream and dorsal where stream originate in different parts of the primary and belt cortex, ultimately project to distinct regions of the prefrontal cortex through independent paths. If you think all sensory areas of the cerebral cortex initially segregate objects' identification and location, it is likely an oversimplification. The Pareto pathways are involved in additional functions, including analysis of the temporal properties of acoustic stimuli. Nonetheless, although the details may differ between systems, the basic concept holds that sensory systems decompose stimuli into features and analyze these in discrete pathways. An intriguing feature of all cortical areas and also shared by the auditory system is the massive projection from the cortex back to lower areas. Corticofusal fibers entering the sensory thalamus are almost 10 times more than axons that project from the thalamus to the cortex. Projections from the auditory cortex also innervate the inferior colliculus, olivocochlear neurons, some basal ganglionic structures, and even the dorsal cochlear nucleus. Therefore, the auditory cortex can actively adjust and improve auditory signal processing in subcortical structures. In other words, ascending sensory pathways are not purely feed-forward circuit, but we should regard the thalamus and cortex as reciprocally and highly interconnected circuits in which the cortex exercises some top-down control for perceptions. Virtually all animals use hearing for localization and recognition of sounds, including behaviorally important communication sounds of individuals of same species, such as mating and warning calls. For animals known as vocal learners, hearing is also necessary for learning to mimic sounds produced by others. Humans are consummate vocal learners. Human speech involves fantastically complex and variable communication sounds, and we depend critically on hearing the speech both of ourselves and others for normal speech development. This sound recognition will be more explained in details in the language series in future. Thank you for watching. That's all for the second part of auditory central nerve system. This is the last video for hearing series. The next series will be the vision. See you then.